So it's raining today, and what do you do if you're a gardener and it's a rainy day? You sow seeds or you prick out seeds. I'm pricking out today. So these are the lettuces that are 10 days old. These are the ones, all the varieties I'm going to use for full heads. So for most of the lettuces that I grow, I harvest individual leaves, and that works pretty well for most of the year. It doesn't work very well in December and January because lettuces aren't growing. So what you need to do is you need to build up a stock of leaves in a full sort of lettuce head, and then harvest those heads through January, February. Make sure you've got something else to plant towards the end of February, otherwise you'll have bare ground until spring. And in my case, I'll probably put overwintered brassicas or some Asian greens or something like that in the place. And yeah, so these, as I say, they're 10 days old. They're looking okay. They've been outside on the patio, and yeah, so we're going to prick them out. I use for pricking out a little bradawl, just because I'm in a workshop, and that's the thing I've got to hand. So let's take a look at the trays. So when I'm preparing these trays, I always make sure to push the compost in quite well and then sort of backfill it until the modules are full. And that is kind of important for all module trays, but it's particularly important for these because they've got these great big holes in them. And if you don't push it down, you'll find the compost kind of falls out the bottom of those holes. But if you do push it down, then you'll find that it's really easy to use your finger to push the modules out. So, and they also air prune on the base. So when the seedlings kind of grow through here, the roots grow through, they prune, which means they stop growing because they're in contact with oxygen. And that means that the little seedling puts down more roots and more roots and more roots and more roots, and you get a really nice root system on these. And as soon as you plant them, those roots that were pruned start growing again, and you just get really strong, healthy plants. And these trays in particular, you can see they've got these little tiny ridges that go down vertically, and they stop their roots spiraling around like that and train them down. So these are basically mini root trainers. Right, so preparing the holes, finger or a pen, and just work your way through these. And again, this is one of the reasons why you've got to really firm your compost in, otherwise you just end up loosening it so much that it all drops out the bottom again. But prepared properly, these trays, containerized trays, are absolutely great. And I'm using the 40 cell tray. There are smaller trays with 60 cells to a tray rather than 40, so-called Charles Dowding trays. I don't like those trays. They dry out really quickly. They're really fiddly to use. They don't have the air pruning. They don't have the root training ribs. I just don't like them at all. I've tried them, I've got them. But these 40 cell trays are great. I can recommend these unreservedly. Okay, so when it comes to lettuce varieties that do well over winter, there aren't really that many of them, I find, that are really good. There are quite a few good ones that overwinter okay for a harvest in spring, but ones that are actually great for a harvest actually in winter itself, there's not so many varieties, especially undercover. So a lot of people like winter density. It doesn't do very well for me undercover. I find it just gets stem rot. It's not very resistant to molds. So these are the ones that I found to be the best for stem rot, and that is Flashy Butter Oak, Brighton, Roxy, Rickia. Now these are all my sort of short versions of the long names of some of them, but I'll put the descriptions up by the side of the screen so you can read them, and obviously you can always find them linked in the description down below. So that's this batch. I'll talk through the next batch as I get to it. So what have you got to think about when you're growing winter lettuce? So the first thing I always say is ventilation is more important than heat, and if you shelter them from the wind, you're going to get much tenderer leaves, crispy and tender rather than tough. So I've just done the flashy, so I'm now going to do the Brighton. So Brighton is the best heading lettuce that I've ever grown. It's very slow to germinate and it's quite slow growing, so you do have to start it reasonably early. But it's a really great but boring lettuce, you know, so it's just green. It's just a green lettuce, moderately crisp, but it makes a good base for a salad mix, and then you can add more interesting lettuce leaves to sort of complement it. But it's just really great. Yes, I don't think I've ever lost a single Brighton to stem rot, and it doesn't seem to suffer at all from tip burn or anything like that. So it's really good, and most of the leaves stay in good condition, which is important. You know, there are some lettuces, you know, where a lot of the leaves are just end up being unusable. So that is Brighton. And yeah, so this is, as I say, it's reliable, but it's not a kind of wonderful lettuce to eat. By comparison, flashy butteroak, I think, is a really lovely lettuce to eat. You know, it's got a really nice texture to it. It's got a really nice colouring, and you know that colouring brings with it a lot of like health benefits and things. It's kind of a mottled, so it's green, but it's got a sort of browny red mottling on the surface, which is really nice. It's got a really nice crisp rib. Yeah, it's definitely a nice one to go for. Nowhere near as much colour as Roxy, but Roxy is fairly green early on in the season. It's only really when it gets to spring that you start seeing a lot of colour in the leaves, but it's kind of worth it, you know, so if you can keep it going until spring, early spring in particular, you get this really nice kind of rusty colour leaf, and you know it's got quite a reasonable crunch to the rib on it as well. So so that is definitely a favourite. So these are Roxy now that I'm starting to prick out. Might be able to even see a little bit of the colour starting to develop on that leaf there. So this Roxy is one that I really like as a lettuce where I harvest the individual leaves as well. So this is one that goes into the polytunnel, because you really don't want to be harvesting individual leaves off lettuce in winter from a low tunnel or a cold frame or something. It's just not, it's not fun. It's much more fun to harvest full heads from these outside beds and harvest individual leaves from the polytunnel, where you can be sort of nice and dry and warm and all that. So next thing to think about is slugs. And slugs are a real challenge when you're growing head lettuces. Not so much when you're growing loose leaf lettuces and you're harvesting individual leaves, because you're harvesting those leaves every week, and so you're kind of looking for the evidence of slugs every week. and you can, you know, remove them as you find them. And they're often little slugs as well, and so they're not actually doing that much damage. They're just kind of hanging out inside, feeding on the sort of crispy rib most of the time. So I use nematodes at this time of year, and I'll do 2 batches of nematodes, like one in September, which I've already done, and then another one in sort of early October, very early October, late September. And that, it won't eliminate the slug problem, but it will reduce it to sort of manageable proportions. And the other thing is obviously just like keep hygiene levels high, like reduce the number of, you know, rotting leaves or weak leaves. Try not to have too many leaves touching the soil. Have a bit of a hunt around, as I say, when you're harvesting. Look for evidence of slugs being there, and, you know, just the black drop-ins kind of thing that you find on the leaves. And that is slugs. So next up on my little list of things to talk about is stem rot. Let me just get this in. Right, so that's the Roxy done. I'm doing 2 trays. I probably won't need 2 trays, but it's always better to have more than you need. So I'll just show you a few things from my workshop, gardening related. So I've got this little bench here where I've got all of my seed garlic, seed shallots, red sun, golden globe. And I used to, when I was doing all my pricking out and seed sowing, I used to have everything on the floor, but now I've got these little benches which fold away, and underneath them they've got all the kids' sort of craft activities and things like that. So they're nicely multi-purpose. They've named their own benches, and we've got kind of overflow storage in here. So right now we've got onions and some more onions in here, and onions down there, but we've got a main storeroom as well. And then here I've got all of my trays and things, and then this is my little potting sort of bench area. So down there I've got my compost. I've got compost for potting on at the back, seed compost at the front, my trusty little tray, and got the tools along here, and that's the brabble that I use for pricking out. And then I've got this grow light here, which I actually find really useful when I'm doing seed sowing. I can kind of lower it down, and I can lower it right down there if I want to, so I can see exactly what I'm doing. Because some seeds, you know, when you're doing, for example, onions, and you want 9 seeds in a module, it's hard to see how many you've put in. And I don't fuss too much over whether it's 9 or 7 or something, but sometimes I even miss whole modules out. Whereas with this sort of really bright, you can see how bright it is, really bright light, there's no excuse basically for missing anything. And so that just kind of hangs down like that, but I can just loop it up like that so that it's a lot higher if I want it out of the way. And when it's really cold, I've got this halogen light here, which is absolutely fantastic because it warms you up no end. Let me see if I can put that on. Oh yeah, the heat is phenomenal from this thing. So it's absolutely perfect on a cold winter's day. And I've got a little mount for my camera, so I can film what I'm doing. It's a bit wobbly, but hopefully the noise cancellation on the phone sorts it out. And now I've got my view of the kitchen garden. So there we go. That's everything that I pricked out today. And I also sowed some giant winter spinach as well.